very happy to have Nathanael Stein from Florida State University at our seminar, which is a joint session of the Ancient Philosophy and its Reception Seminar and of the Research Seminar of the Institute. So he's going to talk about Phantasia and the argument of the Anima, Book 3, Chapter 3. So thanks a lot, Nathanael, for accepting our invitation.
Great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for tuning in. There's a handout. I can share it if you like, Edgar, or would it be easier to share it just in the chat?
Edgar? Nathanael is asking if he...
Yes, certainly. I will take care of that. I can share it. Don't worry.
Okay.
But you're going to share it, sharing the screen. Yes. Okay.
Should I share the screen? Okay.
And if you prefer, or what would you prefer?
Doesn't matter to me.
Okay. No. If you, I mean, I can upload it, and that's fine. So
does that work?
Okay.
Although I think actually, you know what? Maybe sharing in the chat will be better because it's a long handout.
Okay.
And,
okay. I'm going to upload it now.
Yeah, so I apologize for the length of the handout. I usually try to keep them to about 2 pages, and I failed for that. But it's the structure of the chapter is so difficult to, and it's related to the talk, so I thought maybe it would be helpful if you have the basic outline that I'm working with, and I break it up by section on the handout. Also, like I was saying a little bit earlier, I haven't given a Zoom talk in a while, so if there's anything going wrong, or if you can't hear me or want me to repeat something, please just let me know. Okay. De Anima 3.3 and its discussion of Phantasia, traditionally translated imagination, present a series of interlocking puzzles. There are local puzzles about the words on the page and whether we have them right, but also about what the discussion is doing here. Although the chapter ends with a statement of what and why Phantasia is, it doesn't begin as a discussion of that question. And Phantasia seems to be introduced only partway through the chapter, almost incidentally. There are broader interpretive and philosophical questions about what Phantasia actually is, what it does, and how it relates to other mental kinds that Aristotle distinguishes in the De Anima and in his other works, its role in what you could call his cognitive economy. There are puzzles about consistency, both within the chapter and in relation to other works. And finally, there are puzzles about the broader philosophical context. How, in particular, does the discussion here relate to what his predecessors have said about Phantasia and other mental kinds, and to later debates about imagination? And of course, all of these issues feed back down into questions about the words on the page. On this last question about historical context, commentators are often pessimistic. On the one hand, Aristotle is sometimes interpreted as changing the subject or introducing a different use of the term Phantasia in relation to other uses, earlier uses. On the other hand, it's sometimes claimed that it's anachronistic and mistaken 3.3 as a discussion of imagination in a sense that we can recognize, and so that the traditional translation of Phantasia as imagination is misleading. If both of those things are true, then Aristotle's discussion is philosophically disconnected both from what came before and from what came after, even if there's some kind of continuity as a matter of historical fact. I think this would be an unfortunate result, especially in the backwards-looking direction. This chapter contains a series of arguments against a clearly Platonic view expressed in the Sophist, that Phantasia is a kind of opinion combined with or arising from perception. If Aristotle takes himself to be arguing against a view rather than introducing a novel sense of the term or changing the subject, then we should try to understand the argument that he takes himself to be making. So here I want to propose to start with some of the local problems and show how the consequences of my solution play out for some of the more global problems. First, I offer a reconstruction of the chapter and its argument in light of what I take to be its principal aim, which is effecting the transition from the discussion of perception to the discussion of thought, in particular by blocking claims that would blunt the distinction. This, unlike Phantasia, is clearly a concern from the start. The soul is characterized at the start of its chapter by recalling its role in motion and thinking, knowing, and perceiving all together, that is cognition. But thinking and knowing seem to be just like perceiving, according to some, and ancient thinkers at least consider them to be the same. So he says. I think that the same directs and constrains the discussion of Phantasia here more than has been appreciated. In effect, what I want to do is to separate the question of why Aristotle needs Phantasia, that is, its role in his cognitive economy, from the reason he thinks he needs to talk about it in chapter 3 of book 3, and to argue that this separation will both clarify the argument and his view of Phantasia itself. As I interpret the chapter, Phantasia comes into the picture twice in relation to two distinct arguments with the same overarching goal of marking a clear transition from perception to thought. The first argument, down to 427b27, contends with the ancient thought that thinking and perceiving can be understood along basically the same lines as a matter of contact, the so-called like-by-like account. This would mean that we don't need a new model to handle thought. We could simply extend the model that we've developed for perception. The second argument, from 427b27 to the end of the chapter, including the positive account of Phantasia as a kind of secondary change due to perception, contends with the possibility that thinking is partially constituted by Phantasia. As he says, since one part of thinking seems to be Phantasia and the other part judgment, hupolepsis, we must first discuss Phantasia and then thought, which he proceeds to do, taking up thought in its own right at the start of chapter 4. If thinking is partly constituted by Phantasia, and if Phantasia essentially involves the body, then once again, we cannot draw a sharp enough distinction between thinking and other forms of cognition. This is the possibility that he's voiced all the way back in chapter 1 of book 1, 403a to 10, and that's on page 2 of the handout, that thinking would seem to be especially peculiar to the soul. But even if even this is a kind of Phantasia or not without Phantasia, nor would it be possible for it to be without body either, that is in relation to this separability question that he raises right from the start. So by showing what Phantasia actually is, I suggest Aristotle thinks that he's cleared the way. So I argue that Phantasia enters the discussion first indirectly at 427b14 and then becomes the focus of a direct account, but only because its connection to thinking needs clarification and may present an obstacle depending on how intimate that connection turns out to be. I'll take the two parts in turn in order to clarify what Aristotle has concluded about Phantasia and why. To anticipate, I take the results of the second direct discussion of Phantasia to be twofold. Aristotle aims both to clarify the kind of representation it is, since this is one source of confusion, and to pick out its causal basis, since this will help explain how representations with precisely these features are possible. That is, the chapter's ultimate position on the what is it question about Phantasia does not consist only in the claim that it's a kind of secondary change in the perceptual faculty. I'll then turn to a more detailed examination of the arguments against the Platonic view, the one from the sophist, in order to show how Aristotle is disagreeing with Plato and why, which will, I think, hopefully help situate Aristotelian Phantasia in the broader philosophical movement from appearance to imagination. Okay, so now I'll talk about the first appearance in the first part of what I take to be the first part of the chapter. Aristotle's been anticipating from the beginning that thinking may require separate treatment since it's the only part of the soul that might turn out to be separable from the body. But he can't take this for granted. And as the beginning of the chapter makes clear, there are a number of reasons why someone might assume that we can give a uniform treatment of all cognition. After noting the two main distinguishing features of soul, like I said, motion and cognition, Aristotle's first concern is that on some relatively simple but influential ways of thinking, wisdom, phronein, and thought, knowing, are not substantially different from perception. Both are capacities for judgment or discernment. They are what he calls critique. I'll sometimes use the English word critical as a neutral placeholder transition, and that's been a point of contention. But they're both, he states, held to be by some authorities. He mentions Homer and Empedocles, but in Metaphysics Gamma, he attributes the same view to Democritus and Parmenides and Anaxagoras. That is, they hold it to be bodily and to involve discernment of like by like. These opinions about thinking can result in our loosely conceiving it to be a kind of contact, similar to perception. To think about an object is for the object of thought to impress itself somehow on the mind. So this model of thinking as kind of cognitive contact represents an important position. If we think that thought requires separate treatment, so we need to say why the model we've just developed for perception can't simply be extended to cover it, especially since Aristotle's own conception or account of perception is a type of like-by-like theory, according to which the very capacity is the actuality of a certain kind of natural body, insofar as it's capable of being affected by certain ranges of perceptible properties. However much that theory has been made more sophisticated by distinctions between being potentially like and being actually like, between different ways of being affected in De Anima 2.5, and of course the hylomorphic relationship between soul and body. Having raised this problem, Aristotle proceeds to point out ways in which wisdom and thinking differ from perception. Wisdom is said to be obviously different, but distinguishing thought requires more effort. There are two important asymmetries that are introduced, and this is on page 2. For perception of the special objects is always true, the special objects of perception, and belongs to all animals, whereas thinking also admits to being false and does not belong to anything in which there's not also discursive reason. Thought and perception are thus supposed to differ in two respects: their possibilities with respect to truth and falsity, and the kind of living things that can have them, what I'll call their alethic and extensional profiles. Since Aristotle is going to continue to point out that some types of perception can also be false, and that some types of thinking are always true, like episteme and phronesis, I read the alethic contrast as applying only to the special objects of each capacity. That is, perception is always correct about its special objects, whereas thought is not always correct about its special objects. This isn't obvious, though, and I can say more about it below. Further, it's likely that these two differences are related. That is, the fact that perception is always correct about its special objects is related to the fact that it doesn't always involve logos, and the fact that thinking does involve logos is related to its possibility for falsehood. But the precise nature of that connection also needs to be worked out. These distinctions between thought and perception having been made, Phantasia now enters the discussion for the first time at 427b14. He says, for Phantasia is different, both from perception and thinking. It doesn't come to be without perception, and without it, there's no judgment. The Gar seems to indicate that this statement supports one or both of those contrasts. That is, it supports either the contrast that perception is a perception of the special objects is always true, whereas thinking can be true or false, or that perception belongs to all animals, whereas thinking only belongs to beings with logos. He then offers what looks like further support, arguing that Phantasia is not a kind of judgment, and that's on page 3. I won't read all the passages in the handout, but I'll read this one. That Phantasia is not also judgment is clear, for this affection is up to us whenever we wish, for it's possible to make something before one's eyes, just like image makers also place them in their memory techniques. But opining is not up to us, for necessarily we arrive at either falsehood or truth. Further, whenever we opine something terrible or fearful, we're immediately affected, and likewise with what engenders confidence. But with respect to Phantasia, we stand in the same way as if we were contemplating the terrible or attractive things in a picture. So how does this claim about the distinctness of Phantasia from both perception and judgment support the claims about the differences between thought and perception? That is, why would failing to understand the nature of Phantasia, specifically that it requires perception and is a necessary condition of judgment, but is different from both, why would that lead one to conclude that thinking and perception are the same? And why does he support this distinction, specifically that it can't be judgment, by appealing to the claims that fantasia is up to us, that it's voluntary, and that it's not compelling in the way that opinion is. There are several possibilities. I think the most plausible are the following. The first, and I think most plausible, turns on the connection between fantasia and the ordinary non-factive notion of appearing expressed by the verb phantastai. And this has been well discussed in the literature. That is, something can appear F and either be or fail to be F. If we were to analyze all apparently erroneous thinking as instead false appearance, false fantasia, then it would be open to us to claim that thinking as such is immune to error, just like perception. So we could reestablish symmetry in that direction. Alternatively, we might try to reestablish symmetry in the other direction by identifying fantasia with perception, and so arguing that some perception is actually obviously false. So it would either be true that something basic thinking is always true, or not all perception is, or perception even of special objects is not always true. So fantasia constitutes a threat to this distinction between perception and thought, because it can be used to challenge the elethic asymmetry. Alternatively, there may be a way of arguing that it also challenges the extensional contrast, but I'm less interested in that one at the moment. So Aristotle's reply then would be that these false appearances are not instances of perception or of thinking at all, but rather of something else, which is neither. Neither perception nor judgment is up to us, the way fantasia is, and these are compelling in a way that fantasia is not. In particular, fantasia is not a judgment in which we necessarily commit to a truth or falsehood. So false thinking can't be explained away in terms of fantasia, and the asymmetry is maintained. We should also note that by stating that fantasia is different from perception and thinking, Aristotle has technically rejected that first disjunct from chapter 1 about fantasia and its relationship to thinking. That is, he's rejected the thought that they're the same. It may be that this is a more important point than its presentation suggests, since, as I'm going to argue, he also goes on to reject the second disjunct in the next section. Okay, so that's what I think is going on in the first indirect discussion of fantasia, where it comes in, I think, because he needs to talk about it to make clear this distinction between perception and thinking in the face of a possible objection to this asymmetry. Now to the main discussion. So thus far, I think it's only been introduced, as I said, to prevent this contact account from being generalized. Here again, when it's discussed more directly, it's still discussed, I think, for a specific argumentative purpose. Concerning, this is on the handout, we've already seen this, he says, concerning thinking, since it's different from perceiving, but of it in the following way. That is, we need to clarify the relation between fantasia and thinking before we can go on to discuss thinking itself, because thinking seems, to someone at least, to be partially a matter of fantasia already. Now, the precise nature of this turn in the discussion depends on the status of that seems. Is Aristotle reporting another common view about thinking that he intends to reject? Such as a version of a view according to which thinking is a combination of appearance and judgment, and that it's an attitude towards the appearances that one has? Or is he rather stating an opinion that he accepts? Both options, I think, are important, and they pertain to that question about separability. Here, if thinking is a kind of compound formed by appearance and an attitude, like accepting or rejecting, then again, we might argue that thought doesn't represent a further wholly distinct capacity, especially if we already agree that fantasia is common to all animals, and so essentially tied to perception in the body for its content. Thinking would not constitute a faculty in its own right, but rather a special kind of response to the way things appear. And even if this is not Aristotle's view, it's clearly a legitimate enough seeming, since he's going to go on to accept and to claim that phantasmata, appearances, are necessary for thought in more than just the extensional sense that animals who think also have fantasia. In either case, then, we must therefore clarify fantasia itself before discussing thought by itself, since if we do not, we're still open to a challenge that thought is not a distinctive capacity, but rather a further operation of a capacity that can't be specified independently of the type of body in which it's realized. Even here, however, the approach looks indirect. The main effort of this section is to show that Phantasia is none of four critical capacities or states, namely perception, opinion, knowledge, episteme, or thought, nous, are the ones that are named. The majority of that discussion turns on eliminating first perception and then opinion first by itself, and then as arising from or mixed with perception. This is the view from the sophists. And then the positive proposal that Phantasia is a kind of secondary change in the perceptual faculty is introduced. Here, I think a lot turns on the introductory remark that governs the elimination argument. Aristotle states that, and this is on page 4, so if Phantasia is that in accordance with which we say that some phantasma comes to be for us, and we're not speaking metaphorically, it is some single capacity or state among those in accordance with which we discern and arrive at truth or falsehood. Perception, opinion, understanding, and intellect are of this sort. If you read the sentence as it stands in the manuscripts, the inference ought to be that Phantasia is a critical capacity or state, but not identical to any of these four once they're eliminated. But the elimination argument isn't followed by any claim that Phantasia is a capacity or state, let alone a critical one, but rather a secondary change in a critical capacity, namely perception. And so we might doubt whether a change of that sort fits the description. Rawls, perhaps in light of this and because of the general structure of the argument, makes that opening remark a question instead. And if we accept that emendation, then it becomes natural to infer that Aristotle simply means to deny that Phantasia is a critical state or capacity at all. Still, I think the evidence is pretty firmly on the side of reading the passage without the question mark, besides the fact that it's not in any of the manuscripts. For one, Aristotle consistently claims elsewhere that when it comes to action, Phantasia plays the same role in other animals as thought generally plays with us, namely the representational component by which we judge what will, for example, what will allow us to execute a decision or satisfy a desire. And he mentions this feature briefly at the end of this chapter as well. He refers to it unambiguously as critical in de motu. And I think in this chapter, it's plain that he thinks Phantasia can be true or false. And as I would want to argue, they inherit their alethic characteristics from perception. I think there's still a worry about how exactly the resulting type of change could be counted as a critical state or capacity, but we can talk about that later too. So how should we interpret the aim and the results of this elimination argument? I suggest that it's a mistake to read the argument simply as an elimination of four possibilities followed by introducing a fifth option, whether or not that option shares the feature of being critical with the others. For one thing, the fifth option, in this case, is radically different from the other four. Aristotle lists four well-known cognitive states, and then says that Phantasia is a certain kind of change coming about from actual perception. If we read the argument as a simple disjunction elimination with a new candidate revealed, this final move is bizarre, especially since the arguments don't turn on anything to do with the kinds of change that these other cognitive kinds consist in. Instead, I suggest that the elimination argument is aimed at making the epistemic features of Phantasia more precise by showing how it differs extensionally and in its alethic profile from these other kinds of critical mental kinds, especially perception and opinion, which are the most relevant options. Aristotle's arguments show that Phantasia is cognitively unique in such a way that it can't be an intrinsic component of thinking, even if it will turn out to be a necessary condition. But this raises, I think, a question for him about how it's possible for us to be in states with such a cognitively unique profile. And the final proposal from 428b10 to 429a9, the chapter, aims to answer this question. So as I read it, the elimination argument renders the cognitive features of Phantasia more precise, and the positive account of saying what kind of change Phantasia consists in answers the how possible question by indicating the underlying mechanism that explains how we can be in states with just these features. And so I'll go through the argument to say how I think that works and what these features are. This is on page 4 to 5 in the handout. He starts with perception and makes a combination of extensional and alethic contrasts with Phantasia. There can be appearance in situations where perception is neither actual nor potential, as when we're asleep. Being subject to appearance does not entail being percipient. Conversely, being percipient, again, whether actual or potential, is not sufficient for being subject to appearance. Second, perceptions are always true, but most fantasiae are false. This is a puzzling point, and it's been the source of a fair amount of controversy. Puzzling in part because he closes the chapter by claiming that Phantasia can be true or false without emphasizing any particular tendency to falsehood. In any case, Aristotle's claim that most Phantasia are false is also ambiguous. They might be false simply because they usually present what is not in fact present, even if they represent such things accurately, like a squirrel with a correct representation of where its acorns are buried. Or it might mean that they're usually inaccurate. I'll return to that question below. Third, another epistemic point, though maybe a related one, we say it appears, he says, when we don't perceive clearly what something is, and so not in situations in which perception itself is fully active. So far then, the point is that when we invoke this cognitive condition of being subject to appearance, we're describing a situation that can arise independently of perception, doesn't always follow from it, but relates to perceptible objects, and that is epistemically risky in a way that perception is not. Two of the three remaining possibilities are likewise ruled out because they're factive, but opinion does have the feature of being potentially true or false in a given situation, so it's the only plausible remaining candidate. However, Aristotle again argues that opinion, whether by itself or mixed with perception, is different from Phantasia, again on extensional and epistemic grounds. First, now we're on page 5 in the handout. Opinion is accompanied by rational commitment, but most animals have appearance while none have commitment. So there are living beings that have Phantasia but lack opinion. Nor can Phantasia be a kind of perception-based opinion, since one can be subject to a false appearance that something is F, even while having the committed judgment, is one's persuaded that it's not F, without either forgetting or abandoning either. The argument itself is complicated, but the overall point is pretty clear. So both opinion and Phantasia are epistemically risky in that they represent things as being a certain way, even though they might not be that way. But Phantasia lacks the kind of rational commitment that opinion entails. This is clearly an important point, and Aristotle dwells on it in the subsequent discussion of opinion with, through, or mixed with perception, even though the sun example has some obscurities to it. Presumably, the reason for discussing this variation is not just because it's expressed by Plato, but because tethering opinion to perception in this way could ground an attempt to bypass that rationality constraint. Ordinary opinion entails commitment, and rational commitment so it requires discursive reason. But perhaps if there were a kind of opinion that retained the non-discursivity of its origins in perception, then this would yield the right kind of representation that we describe in terms of appearance, and that would resist persuasion, for example. Aristotle's argument here seems to be that even perception-based opinion differs from the kind of epistemically risky but non-committal representation that constitutes being subject to appearance. Most likely, I think we should read non-committal here in a weak sense. Opinion entails commitment, but Phantasia does not. But this being non-committal is compatible with sometimes being rationally committed to its contents and sometimes with simply endorsing them as true, but in a non-rational way. So opinion entails commitment, Phantasia does not, but is consistent with it. And opinion, even if it's based in or mixed with perception, still entails commitment of a type that can't coexist with considered judgments to the contrary in the way that misleading appearances can. And so he wants to argue. That concludes the elimination argument. Aristotle then introduces his positive proposal as a possibility alongside some recapitulations of the properties of Phantasia that had been salient in the preceding discussion. Phantasia seems to be a sort of change that accompanies perception despite being distinct from it. It would be about the perceptibles and impossible without perception. Animals do and suffer many things in accordance with it, and it's both true and false. This last point is then argued for by showing how the truth and falsity of different sorts of perception would transfer over to the relevant Phantasiae. In particular, if the change that constitutes actual perception can yield a further similar change in the perceptual system, then we would undergo a similar representation, that is one with similar content, without the causal requirement of perception, and so represent the same things independently of whether they continue to obtain, and without necessarily endorsing the representation. So I suggest that the overall argument of this section should be understood as follows. Accepting a basic sense, according to which Phantasia in the non-extended sense is that whereby a phantasma comes to be for us, it must also be a capacity whereby we judge and speak truly or falsely. That is, it must genuinely represent things as being a certain way. But it can't be straightforwardly identified with perception, opinion, understanding, or intellect. None of those have the right combination of being potentially true or false in a given situation, and of being the kind of uncommitted representation that occurs when we're not sure about the properties of what we perceive, and that can even resist and persist alongside rationally committed representation to the contrary. Phantasia is therefore a kind of representation, but it's cognitively distinct from all these critical states or capacities, and so epistemically speaking, it's sui generis. However, it doesn't represent a distinct psychological capacity. What best accounts for these features is a secondary sort of change in the perceptual faculty, the aestheticon. Phantasia is therefore not identical with the capacity nor with its primary activity, but nor is it some further capacity or state independent of perception. Broadly construed, it's a non-committal, non-discursive representation of perceptibles constituted by a secondary change that results from the primary activity of the perceptual faculty. By making the positive proposal that Phantasia is a kind of secondary change in the perceptual faculty, which takes its contents from the three kinds of perception, Aristotle therefore also limits the range over which it can represent or misrepresent perceptibles, preserving a distinctive range over which thought alone has to function. Thought can't simply be an attitude towards an appearance or combination of appearance and attitude if appearance itself is an activity entirely contained within the perceptual faculty and restricted to perceptible contents. So once we understand Phantasia and its cognitive differences from perception and thought, dependent on the former causally and for its content, and distinct from the latter in terms of its content and the capacities involved, then we can see that thought does remain a distinct topic that demands a distinct treatment, whether or not it actually turns out to be separable in one of the ways that he's going to go on to discuss in chapter 4. Okay, so much for the two arguments, I think, that constitute chapter 3 of book 3. He's introduced Phantasia in order to justify giving a different account of thinking, according to which it'll turn out to be somehow distinct, as he's been anticipating. So unlike with nutrition, perception, and thought, Aristotle doesn't introduce Phantasia because he thinks it's just a basic function of soul that a science of the soul needs to address. He does, however, think it's an important function of the perceptual soul, and we can clarify what he thinks it is when we see the limited purposes of his discussion of it here. I think this reading accounts for the fact that he distinguishes perception and discursive states twice. As I said, the first is required to reject the basic contact account, and the second is required for rejecting the thought that it's an intrinsic part of thinking or a type of thinking, depending on how you read that sentence. But it has further consequences for our understanding, I think, of how Aristotle sees Phantasia as compared to readings for which, for example, it's the goal of the chapter and the primary function of Phantasia is to account for falsehood, or to show that Phantasia is its own quasi-independent faculty. If the primary aim is just to reject the view that thinking is a matter of taking up an attitude towards appearances, or that is a category comprised of appearance and judgment, then it makes sense that Aristotle's arguments distinguishing Phantasia from these other critical states and capacities are based on epistemological and extensional claims. This cluster of features, right, is a difficult set to satisfy. It's a critical state with respect to which we judge true and false, but not identical to a standard one, strongly associated with inaccuracy, can be true or false, but genuinely represents things as being a certain way without yielding the kind of commitment that is typical of opinion. It's non-discursive, and it seems to function independently of rational persuasion. So we need to account for the possibility of a form of representation by which we judge truth and falsity, but which is non-discursive, especially associated with mistakes, but also somehow, despite being associated with mistakes, somehow non-committal. That, I think, is a difficult line to walk, and it raises a natural how possible question. So when he says that if nothing else, has the things described besides Phantasia, and this is what was said, then we should include all of those properties of non-metaphorical appearances as being the properties of Phantasia to which Aristotle is referring, and the causal account as the basis of its having them. They're not simply distinguishing marks that allow us to see that Phantasia is somehow sui generis, but they clarify the pre-theoretical nature of being subject to appearance before indicating the causal basis that explains how a form of representation can have those features. The only barely unspoken point, unspoken here, but made explicit elsewhere, is that Phantasia and perception are one but different in being, or definition. Phantasia is entirely contained within the faculty of perception and restricted to its objects, though not to be identified with perception as such. So rather than claiming that Phantasia is a distinct ability not to be identified with any of those, he's claiming that it's a distinctive representational kind of and in the perceptual faculty, not the same as perception as such. It is something that perceivers are subject to and can be responsible for both accuracy and mistakes in representation and action without being supplemented by a judgment. This reading, I think, also accounts for a fact that would otherwise be curious. Phantasia, when we look at it elsewhere and across the whole of the works, is utterly pervasive in Aristotle's account of cognition and cognitive progress, since it accounts especially for memory and experience. But it's not given credit for that role in the descriptions of the stages of cognition that we see in Metaphysics 1 or Posterior Analytics 219. And outside of the De Anima and the psychological works, it's usually invoked in the more cognitively limited or risky role. But without the ability to retain and rework its contents, the perceptual faculty would be largely useless to animals and certainly an inadequate basis for cognitive progress. But it's neither of those things. He doesn't include it along with these others when he lists and goes through the stages of our cognitive progress, because it's already included under perception, being a special form of representation perceivers have in virtue of their perceptual faculty's secondary changes. Indeed, I think this is maybe the strongest reason for resisting the thought that Phantasia's function in Aristotle's cognitive economy is essentially determined by the need to account for the possibility of falsehood. In relation to his wider philosophical concerns, Phantasia's role is inseparable from his empiricist aim of accounting for the way knowledge arises from perceptual experience. Phantasia, despite being epistemically risky, is the basis of all cognitive success beyond perception itself, and it's the basis of that because of its fidelity to its original source. His argument in 3.3 likewise doesn't invoke Phantasia to solve a problem about the possibility of falsehood. Rather, it assumes that Phantasia can be true or false, just like thought and opinion, which is why it's difficult to provide the sharp separation of thought that his argument and his theory requires. So Aristotle's aim here is not, in this chapter, is not to introduce and explain this cognitive ability in its own right, but he is keen when he does so to preserve the features of it that matters most. It's an ability to retain and recover perceptual experience in a way that brackets it from one's present environment, kind of presentation of perceptibles but not as present, especially for animals that can use it for rational purposes. He needs to tell a story about how perception can yield the kind of cognitive success that he thinks it does without simply handing over all the success to our capacity for discursive thinking. Knowledge is not simply a matter of thinking well about what we perceive, which would be the result if we analyzed Phantasia as an intrinsic part or kind of thinking. Okay. So much by way of summing up what I think the chapter is doing in its argument and how I think that clarifies the basic notion of Phantasia that he's working with. Now I want to turn to at least some of the ways in which that particular argument about perception-based opinion can be a response to Plato rather than a change of subject or a change of terminology. For that, with relation to that question, I think we want to know, so what is the significance of rejecting this Platonic view? In particular, what do we learn from considering the claim that perception is a kind of perception-based opinion when Aristotle has already rejected the claim that it's a kind of opinion at all? That is, he rejects the claim that it's an opinion, and he doesn't think those reasons go away once you talk about perception-based opinion. So why do we get further discussion of perception-based opinion on its own? I think it's important to be clear that the whole discussion of falsehood in the sophist, in which Plato's account of Phantasia as opinion through or mixed with perception appears, and which includes the famous battle of gods and giants, is prefaced and motivated by a problem about appearance. The final proposal for defining the sophist is in terms of an ability or craft of false appearances, understood as the creation of misleading copies. This first involves distinguishing copies, eidola, into accurate images, eikona, and inaccurate appearances, phantasmata, and likewise two crafts of making them, eikastike for likenesses and phantastike for appearances. But it's precisely this latter notion of misrepresentation that's difficult to account for and ultimately requires coming up with a response to Parmenides' argument about non-being arguments. So this is what I give you on chapter 6, starting out the discussion. To appear and to seem this but not be, and to say such things but not truly, all these things are and have always been full of confusion. It's altogether hard to figure out how one should say one really is speaking or believing falsely, and to state this without getting stuck in contradictions. The relevant conclusions about Phantasia as a kind of opinion are from the end of the argument about the possibility of falsehood, having conceded that what is not, non-being nevertheless is, since what is not is different from what is. We still have to show that there can be false speech or thinking, that we can actually say or think what is not. We can, the stranger argues, because although all speech must be about something that is, nevertheless it's possible to say something different from what is. And if opinion is analyzed as silent speech, in turn, then it's also possible to think what is not. Finally, a certain kind of opinion is then connected with the notion of false appearance that started the difficulty, by pointing out that when opinion, the result of this internal speech, is acquired not intrinsically, but through perception, this is what we call Phantasia. That's the second passage under section 4 there. So Phantasia occurs when we conduct or conclude the silent conversation of thinking in such a way that the opinion that results is somehow a result of perception, as distinct from a kind of opinion that reaches a conclusion on the basis of the conversation alone. So for Plato, the possibility of falsehood in thought is grounded in the possibility of false speech, and the fact that thought, analyzed as a kind of silent speech, therefore has discursive structure. This in turn allows us to understand the notion of being subject to appearance in terms of internal speech that proceeds in a way that's somehow dictated from the outside, that is not intrinsically, by perception. Against this statement that Phantasia is a kind of opinion, either caused by or mixed with perception, Aristotle first argues that the genus is wrong, precisely because he agrees with Plato. Opinion involves rational commitment and therefore discursivity. And the fact that animals and children get things wrong despite lacking reason is a good reason to think that they're subject to appearance, to Phantasia. Combining opinion with perception doesn't help, he then argues, because the resulting opinion would be about the object of perception in such a way that conflicts with the datum, that we can simultaneously have a false appearance and a true judgment about the same perceptible. These conflicts occur, but they don't exhibit the properties of a conflict between contradictory opinions. Although his argument for this has some obscurities, he presents two options. Either we're changing from a true opinion to a false one, or he then says if one has the same opinion, necessarily the same opinion is true and false. The first option is pretty clear. B has been obscure and subject to some controversy. But however we interpret it, the options, the conclusion is clear enough. He thinks these conflicts in which false appearance persists despite countervailing rational judgment show that the notion of being subject to appearance needs to be analyzed in terms of this non-discursive and therefore non-doxastic representation. Nevertheless, it still is subject to norms of truth and falsehood, can govern action, and there are norms of truth and falsity and correctness and incorrectness even without discursive thinking. I think there's a second strand of what's going on in this chapter that also conflicts with what Plato says about appearances, but for the purposes of what I want to say here and for time, I'll skip that for now. Fundamentally, I think the point is that Aristotle and Plato disagree about the origins of cognitive success and failure, especially with respect to the role of perception. They agree that Phantasia in the epistemic sense is risky, It's a situation in which things appear a certain way, but may not be the way they appear. Plato, however, argues, at least in some places, that epistemic risk and reward is a result of discursive thinking and the possibility that one might come to a wrong determination on the basis of unclear starting points. But he seems to think that perception only plays an enabling role in cognition, and that even what Aristotle would consider to be imagistic representations are parasitic on discursive ones. And here I'm thinking of the examples in the Philebus of the person having these pleasurable expectations about the future, which he thinks are ones in which the imagistic representation is derived from a discursive one. Aristotle thinks that truth and falsity enter the picture much earlier, and that a great deal of our cognitive success and failure is not just due to the quality of our perceptual activity, but consists in that activity itself. So the view that Phantasia, that is epistemically risky representation, is a matter of discursive thinking going well or badly, is missing an important point about where normativity enters the cognitive picture. Its causal basis is our ability to represent objects of experience independently of their continued presence. That ability is also at work in our success, since it underwrites our ability to abstract from and combine the results of individual experiences into universal grasp and deliberated action. So to take an analogy with the ethics, just as sound reasoning about what to do isn't conducive to living well without good habituation and experience and the grasp of ends that these involve, so good thinking without sound and elaborated perceptual experience isn't conducive to knowledge. Phantasia, in the epistemic sense of being subject to a kind of appearance, therefore becomes identified with the psychological phenomenon of mental imagery in order to account for these cognitive features of extended perceptual activity. So its role in Aristotle's cognitive economy is already the one that it occupies for much of the subsequent tradition. It's the bridge between perception of particulars and rational thought. Okay, so here I wanted to argue that in 3.3, he argues about Phantasia for the reasons I've suggested, and that he stakes out an expanded role for the perceptual faculty to cover the phenomenon of being subject to appearance. This is necessary to account for the facts and to prevent the notion of appearance from obscuring the difference between perception and thinking. To make his argument, he needs to work from two sides. He needs to clarify the epistemic features of Phantasia, what it means for something to appear a certain way to a subject, and also to account for the underlying mechanism that makes such representation possible. In doing so, he introduces the notion that Phantasia involves a kind of quasi-perceptual representation that's parasitic on perception, both for its content and for its alethic profile, and thus at one remove from what it represents. This is well within the range of what philosophers continue to call sensory imagination. The idea that Phantasia consists in having such imagery, however, is not presumed from the start, nor simply asserted, but posited to explain the epistemic features of being subject to appearance. So the view here straddles and so connects the tradition of thinking about Phantasia in terms of simply being subject to appearances, and the later tradition of thinking about it in terms of a faculty for mental imagery, since Aristotle identifies it with the latter as a way of explaining the former. I think there are plenty of puzzles about these texts that are still there and that I haven't accounted for. But we can see that on this account, at least, his discussion of Phantasia is neither a change of subject in relation to Plato, nor is it a terminological change, but nor is it an anachronism to call it a theory of imagination. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Nathanael, for this great talk. Now we're going to open the discussion section. So please raise your hand. Yes. Tessie Schlosser, please.
Hi, Nathanael. Thank you for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I was wondering, if I understand correctly, you're saying that Phantasia is non-committal, and at first you described also Phantasia as what we wish for something to appear. So when you, in the first section, when it appears, Phantasia is something that we wish for. So an appearance that we wish for. And I'm wondering if, I think their wish is boulomenoi, so that kind of wish or desire, which also could be willing for something. So how can we differentiate that wishing for something or that willing for something from a form of commitment?
Good. So there in that what you're in that passage, I was saying it's up to us whenever we wish, but I didn't mean to imply that it involves, it's a kind of wishing, but rather that it's voluntary. It's under our control, and he refers to these imagistic forms of memory techniques, it seems. So there, I would say, just because we're able to bring these images before our minds, as you say, before our eyes, that's under our control. And so it's, in that sense, and usually non-committal, right? But that's consistent with its being, or with our being sometimes committed to the truth of the contents, either rationally or non-rationally. So I didn't mean to suggest that it's an expression of wish, although sometimes people have argued that. I think sometimes a fantasy as a kind of expectation, and I think he does associate it with that. But I didn't mean to suggest here that it's a kind of, it's necessarily kind of wishing that would presumably, I think you're right, be inconsistent with thinking that the thing is true. Because you wish for something because you think it's not there. Does that address, am I getting the question right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about that voluntariness and how that is different from the commitment you're talking about. So what does commitment entail in time or in appreciation? Or so like, is something more ephemeral, like a kind of voluntariness that passes, and then the other kind is a commitment that you hold on to? So how do we differentiate between them? Is it a matter of time? Is it a matter of more will, like a different kind of volition? So how do we differentiate that commitment from the kind of wishing that you're talking about?
I see. Good. One thing is that he doesn't say nearly, I think, enough about that, but he does say some things about it, and it seems to be partly a matter of context. If you look at, think about what he says about memory. A memory involves a phantasma that arises and is conjoined with a perception of time having passed. And we can take those phantasmata either as images, as likenesses of things, or not that way. And that's part of another thing that I thought was relevant to his discussion of Plato. That is, he thinks these things are intrinsically what they are resemblances of the perceptions that cause them, but they may be taken also as images, as representations of the things that cause the perception, or simply considered in their own right. So it seems to be, and maybe one other reason why he doesn't often talk about it on its own when he's talking about what kind of mental activity we're doing, is that it's the kind of thing that can underwrite and is present in a variety of kinds of mental kind, including memory, dreaming, and so forth.
Thanks a lot. Esteban?
I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Esteban, we cannot hear you.
You don't say you're muted, but I don't see it. We don't hear sound. Maybe ask in the chat.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be a problem. So let's move to the next question, Esteban, and then we see if we can solve the issue. Yes? Ivan, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So thanks for the talk, and thanks to the organizers. My question is a little bit related to Tessie's question. Well, actually, I have two really quick ones. So one is just to explain a little bit more about what you mean by this idea of non-committal representation, Phantasia being a non-committal representation. Mm-hmm. Sorry, it's raining here. I was worried. The reason I was worried is that non-committal sounds to me like something rational, and as you know, Aristotle attributes Phantasia to most, if not all, animals. So I'm just wondering how that works. And then the second question is about, so I think I agree with you that the chapter is not to explain error, let's say all error, nor is it to identify a new faculty. So I'm on board with quite a bit of what you're saying. But I was wondering how you can incorporate, it does seem, at least at the beginning of the chapter, that error is a big issue, and that he thinks his predecessors can't understand it or don't understand it properly, or it dismiss it in some way. So I'm wondering what you think, how that feeds in to the chapter, or if that, how you explain that. One way might be just to say, well, given that Phantasia is more often false, he is to some degree explaining error, but not to imply either that Phantasia is always a problem or some kind of deficit, nor that it explains all error. But I'm wondering what you think about that. Thanks.
Good. Yeah, thank you. So on the first one, the question about it being non-committal, I agree with the notion of commitment that he brings in this chapter. He certainly associates with rational commitment, and that's one of the reasons why he thinks it can't be a kind of opinion. So what I wanted to say there was that it's non-committal in the sense that it's consistent with being either taking things to be the way they're represented to be in the by the appearance, and not taking them to be so, or or needn't be taking them not to be that way, but it's consistent with the simply being aware of a representation of things being a certain way. And there I think it's important that he doesn't clarify whether, when he says that they're mostly false, whether he means just that they are presentations of what isn't present, which would be one meaning of false, and seems to be, I think, indicated by some of the things he says, or whether he means genuinely that they're mostly inaccurate, which would be embarrassing for, as you say, all the other reasons, things that he thinks animals depend on, non-rational animals depend on this all the time, and they get lots of things right. And even, we, when we're in a lot of ordinary life, we depend on it for its being accurate as well. So I think he's simply taking it when he's describing what it is to be subject to appearance in this way. At the bare status, it's just non-committal only in that sense. It doesn't involve withholding commitment, but as a kind, one can be in that kind of state and be committed to, that is, take it to be representing things that are the way they are, or not taking them to be so. On the question about error, I agree. So especially in that first point, he seems to think that the accounting for error is an embarrassment for the people who have this simple model according to which thinking and perception are both bodily, sort of like by like affairs. And it's something he mentions a couple times in book one. So I think he takes that to be an embarrassment, but I also take it that he thinks that is one of the reasons for just being aware of the contrast, that is because we know that thinking can be true or false. And and he doesn't seem to feel the need to argue for how that can be, maybe because he thinks Plato's solved that question. But he takes it as that it's a premise in the argument that Phantasia the perception and thinking are not the same, is that thinking is true or false, and basic perception is always true. So I agree. So the question about falsehood and its possibility, and in particular these relevant passages from the Theaetetus and the Sophist, are really, they leave their marks all over the chapter. But I don't see him introducing this as a way to account for falsehood in his own right. I think he takes for granted that it can be true or false, and that's one of the reasons why he needs to discuss it, because it resembles and so could be taken to be a kind of thinking or opinion, right? Precisely because it has that same profile, but what he wants to show is that it isn't, because it doesn't have further features that we associate with thinking, but is nonetheless still something whereby we represent and act.
Thanks a lot. Esteban, I think the issue is solved. Yeah.
Let me try. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, Nathanael. You partially answered my question already in your answer to Ivan. So just if I'm following you well, Phantasia is in a sense quasi-perceptual, but it's of course independent from perception. It's its own faculty. It's also not judgment, and it has in particular the capacity to be false. Now, there's this role of Phantasia in explaining error. For instance, what we would call misperception or perceptual error, if I followed you well. On the other hand, it will also has a capacity to be true, and it has a positive role as a cognitive faculty. For instance, I guess in the memory of perception, that, as you mentioned, right? Like a memory of perception would be a case of Phantasia. I wanted to just clarify that it would not be kind of a perception itself, right? If I remember, I perceive something, that would be Phantasia. And the second question was about misperception, although I think you already answered it. So there's, strictly speaking, according to Aristotle, no possibility of perceiving falsely something, so that whenever there's something we would normally call misperception, it's the faculty of Phantasia that is responsible for that misrepresentation. And in like particular examples, like of, let's say, an optical illusion or another kind of sensory illusion, would that be a Phantasia kicking in so that perception itself cannot fail? And what would happen in cases such as plain hallucinations of like seeing something that is not there or something like that? That's basically the question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I had wanted to say was that Phantasia it can be true or false, and that's one of the points that he wants to make about it, but so can perception, and that is the argument in the last section. Is aiming to show, and he concludes this way, that Phantasia can be true or false precisely because it inherits its contents from different kinds of perception. And these can be true or false. And he goes through them one by one, saying, well, special object perception is always true, but these other two kinds of perception are prone to falsehood. And so he concludes Phantasia is capable of being true and false. So that I take it, in fact, that that's him reconnecting the discussion to this question about what kind of critical state or capacity it is, critical state or capacity whereby we judge and speak truly or falsely. It is, and here's how we can show that it's capable of being true or false, right? Because it inherits its properties from perceptions, including ones that are true. So it's, if you're having an appearance of something while you're perceiving it, or of the thing while you're perceiving it, is true while you're perceiving it. That seems much thinner than the notion of true Phantasia that he actually works with, but he does at least derive both possibilities of truth and falsehood for Phantasia. And so, that's what I wanted to argue in terms of how it can be true or false, but I think he takes for granted that perception by itself can be false sometimes. And now there's a worry that people have raised independently about the nature of perception and how perceptual content, especially sophisticated perceptual content, can arise and whether it requires Phantasia already. And so even on that account of how, say, perceiving something and square, or the thing that the red thing is square, and thinking that and getting that wrong, whether that's already involving Phantasia, but that's not part of the argument here. And so I would think we need to bracket it. He derives the true-false propensities from Phantasia from perception, which he takes for granted can be true or false. And again, and it fits well with the thought that it's not an independent faculty or capacity, it's simply extended functionality of the perceptual capacity in some animals, most of them.
Thank you very much. That clarifies many points I seem to have not gotten well. But so if perception can be itself in error, then the original point that he discusses, that you may need Phantasia as a way of introducing error, then that's not his real reason for accepting it as a kind of.
But I don't think that's why he introduces it. I think he introduces it because some people might try to preserve this a like-by-like kind of view by saying what we counted it. You say thinking can be true or false, perception can't. But thinking, if you think about the idea that for an abstract, trying to think about an abstract object, you either succeed or you don't think about the thing at all, right? So that all basic conception is true, which is something he seems to think when we're talking about at least those simples, rather than thinking discursively. Then someone could say, look, basic thinking is always true, just like basic perception. What you're talking about as false thinking is really just a matter of appearance. And so we can preserve that asymmetry, we can preserve the like-by-like account. So I think that's why he introduces in that first part, Phantasia. It's a problem for the asymmetry that he wants to draw. At least that's something. It's a strange introduction, but that's the way that I account for it, rather than saying that it's introduced specifically to account for falsehood. I think he takes it for granted that there's a contrast there. Yeah.
Thank you. That clarifies a lot. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yes, thank you for your talk, Nathanael. I had a question about, it's a clarification question. I'm not sure I understood part of what you were arguing. So in the, I guess the section of the chapter beginning around 428b10, where he sets out this view that Phantasia is a certain kind of kinesis caused by perception. Now, at the end of the chapter, he says, well, now we've set out what Phantasia is and how it comes about. Were you arguing that this section where he says it's a kind of kinesis is not an answer to the what it is question, but rather it's an answer to the question how it comes about?
Good. No, I take it that it's the component of it's a combined account, a causal account of Phantasia. What is Phantasia? A certain kind of representational state with its own specific cognitive profile, brought about by secondary perceptual change. It's a component of the account of what a thing is that includes its cause. So I think that's often how he wants to define things. It is both by reference to their apparent features and their causal profile.
So when you say it's a representational state, do you mean a hexis, which he refers to earlier? Is that what you mean? It's not a kinesis. It's actually a hexis, or is it both?
Yeah, good. So this relates to the fact that and with maybe why Ross puts in that question mark, because he doesn't say it's a hexis or a capacity, and he seems to deny outright that it's a capacity. So one possibility for that. So I don't think he's saying there. So therefore, it is a hexis, right? He doesn't say that. But I do think he thinks it's something critique. It's critical, and this is how it comes about. So can we therefore say it's a hexis? I think that initial description is at least vague, and there are places where he's willing to say that a change is sort of a hexis. I can look up those references where because I worry about this question. Or he could say that as a matter of representation, it's fine to call it a hexis. There's a hexis being maybe the flip side of it's what results from a change, generally speaking. But the causal basis of that is this change, right? And so there could be, he could be simply now referring to the change by which it comes to be, such that, but because these things can remain, and he does say that in that section too, there's the change by which they come to be, and then they also remain, which might be, if he were keen to argue that it is nonetheless a hexis, that might be what he would say. But I agree that he doesn't, I don't think that he settles the question of saying it's any alternative kind of thing, other than saying that it's a kind of change. But I think I'm more certain that he thinks it's critical, and that my main proposal is that this account of how it comes to be is part of what he thinks it is, but it's not simply the whole story.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sinia?
Thank you for this very interesting talk. Well, I don't know, I'm not sure if you have already explained this, but I really wanted to ask you about this question. Can you please explain a little bit more why Aristotle thinks that Phantasia is voluntary, or is up to us, or is in our control, while opinion is not? Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's a good question. In particular, I mean, it's a puzzling thing that he says there for a couple of reasons. In particular, why, what he means when he's trying to say that opinion is not up to us. And I think it gets some commentary, but I take it the first part, that Phantasia is up to us. He seems to me to be appealing to a commonly understood phenomenon whereby we are able to present things to ourselves. We would call them mental images, but I don't think he presumes that or puts it on the table first. But he gives this example of these image makers who are appealing to memory. So I think that's maybe just a bit of psychological data, that some kinds of appearance are under our control. We do them voluntarily, but also involuntarily when we dream. So it's certainly not the case that he thinks that they're always voluntary. Why he says he contrasts that with opinion, that's a little harder, especially because sometimes opinion seems to be, it's possible for us to suspend judgment, for example, when we are presented with certain appearances. But I take it seems to me what he's got in mind there is that when one has an opinion, necessarily one is committed to something true or false. Whereas when one has a representation of things being a certain way, that is an appearance, a fantasia of things being a certain sort of way, one isn't necessarily committed to something true or false, because one isn't necessarily committed. Does that help with your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Sinia. Ricardo?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, Nathanael. I just have a quick question, very small question about your one of the main passages that you cite in your handout, which is this passage in 428a1-5, no, which is the passage where Aristotle says that in your translation, so if Phantasia is that in accordance with which we say that some phantasma comes to be for us, and we are not speaking metaphorically, it is some single capacity or state among those in accordance with which we discern. My question here is how do you understand the disjunction there, the or? No, I mean, it is either one thing, I mean, it is either one capacity or a state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are they presented here as exclusive, and what Aristotle is saying is that it is either one or the other, but he hasn't decided yet which one it is, or it's or is state a kind of gloss of an explanation, an explanatory of dynamis. So I mean that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a difficult passage for a lot of reasons. I like the suggestion that it could be a gloss rather than a disjunction, partly because the other options don't seem to be obviously capacities in his own technical sense, episteme, nous, and opinion. They're not what he would call distinct parts of soul, or things that happen in virtue of our capacity to think. So that would make a kind of nice sense of the array of choices that he presents. And the array of choices is an interesting set already, I think, for a bunch of other reasons, but it would help the point if he's being deliberately a bit vague. And it would help me, of course, because then I wouldn't be constrained to say, well, so he must think it's a capacity or a hexis, therefore it's not a capacity, it must be a hexis. But that is, I think he wants to include in this range. It's also puzzling why he even lists, episteme and nous, since they're so obviously non-starters for being Phantasia. But so yeah, I think a gloss, or at least a somewhat hands-off kind of way of stating the point, or laying down the territory would be a helpful way to read it. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Daniel?
Yes, I had a follow-up question about that passage which Zinnia asked about, where he says that Phantasia is up to us, it's voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that, well, this is something that human beings or rational animals have, but other animals do not have. I'm not sure what you think about that, but if that's true, it looks like he's talking about a certain kind of capacity that human beings have to call up images. And in deliberation, that might also be involved, where when we're imagining different kinds of consequences of actions, it's not sort of passive Phantasia. We're actively calling up images and so forth. So that would be perhaps a capacity, understanding Phantasia as a capacity which human beings have, perhaps other animals do not have, but it's not going to serve as a kind of general account of Phantasia, because it doesn't apply to Phantasia where it's not up to us. They're just curious about what you think about that. I mean, I'm sort of inclined to think, well, this is a different sort of Phantasia from what he's giving us a definition of, which is supposed to be general for all the Phantasia that all animals have, or all animals that have Phantasia. Whereas what he's talking about here is a certain kind of capacity, which is perhaps closely linked to the general notion of Phantasia, but it's nevertheless distinct.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. That is, I think he probably does have in mind specifically something, not something, as you say, general to all Phantasia, but something that rational beings like us can do, something that helps us get a grip on what's distinctive about this phenomenon that we call being subject to appearance. And where I think, part of my overall reading of the chapter is that we start by talking about Phantasia, presuming something about its epistemic features, right? That is, it's what we're talking about when we say it appears to me, or I'm subject to an appearance of a certain sort. And then we can derive things when we've sorted out and gotten clear on just what the general features and the range of features that this kind of a notion of appearance can have. Then we can look for causes and give an account of how precisely what it is in virtue of what we're able to do all those sorts of things. And he thinks that's because of this extended ability of the perceptual faculty to undergo the secondary kind of change. And so, which is a way of saying that Phantasia is kind of given a real definition of a sort, but without suggesting that all of the mental kinds that involve Phantasia constitute a single natural kind. Memory is distinct from experience, but both of them depend on elaborations of retained perceptual stimulations, right? And likewise dreams, they're distinct, but they all depend on this same thing, which is ultimately something that the perceptual faculty does in beings like us. And the more sophisticated you get, the more control you might have over them. So yeah, I think that's helpful.
Thanks a lot. Ricardo, do you have another question? Okay. I think I have one question, if I may. Nathanael, I was wondering about your claim that, the introduction of Phantasia doesn't have, or the account of Phantasia doesn't have as its main aim giving an account of error, right? Which was something that you defended and that Ivan was questioning one of his previous questions. And I was thinking that something must be said about the beginning of the chapter, right? Because as you know, the chapter begins. He says some passage that you have quoted, but then after that, Aristotle says that the ancients, right? The ancients said that understanding phronein, so something like knowing and perceiving are the same, right? Mm-hmm. Which seems like, of course, Aristotle seems to be having the theaetetus in mind, right? The definition of knowledge as perception, because as you know, Plato thought that was the view of the ancients. And so he says, Aristotle says, well, then, but they should have said something about error, right? If that's true, because that's more pervasive. And also, and he gives a disjunction, as you know, but one of the disjunctions says, because then all appearances would be true. Mm-hmm. So he uses, of course, phenomena. So it seems like the problem there is that, of course, that there's no possibility of false judgment, because if perception is knowing, then there's nothing like a false judgment. But what is interesting is the use of phenomena there, I think, mm-hmm. because that's 427b1, and you emphasize that Phantasia comes later in 427b14. That's the first mention of Phantasia. Mm-hmm. But phenomena also refers to Phantasia at that point, I think. So that's like the first mention of something related to Phantasia. And I guess that the reason is because in the theaetetus, in the first part, it's clear that perceiving is synonymous with phainastai. Broad is synonymous, especially in the account of Protagoras' view, which gives what things appear to us as the things that one perceives. It's important that phainastai and perception same. So Aristotle seems to be having there like a history of the problem of falsehood there, at least as Plato renders it in the Theaetetus, in which knowledge is perception and perception is Phantasia. Mm-hmm. Something like that. and so it seems that he has to work its way to distinguish Phantasia from knowledge, and of course, if he does that from thinking and from perceiving, on the background of that problem of how to account for error, right? How is it that Phantasia is not the same as perceiving? And so that's like I mean, of course, I think this has been, of course, pointed out before, but I think that's like would be like my main reason to think that or to doubt that one can disconnect Phantasia in the way you suggest from the let's say the project of giving an account of error. At least, I mean, he's clear that the ancients didn't do that. Did Plato do that? Well, in the Theaetetus, that's not evident, and in the Sophists, it seems that Phantasia plays a big role in that, and so it seems that Aristotle seems to be working on that context. So what would you say about?
Yeah, so I agree that the Theaetetus here, and including especially the fact that in the Theaetetus we get Protagoras to identify perception and Phantasia, is relevant to the discussion, and that's one of the problems that he has with it. I think that's one of the reasons why he talks about it in the second part. And I agree that the fact that it would be an absurdity if it turned out that all the phenomena were true, all the things that appear are true, is one of the things that he makes him think that this view has to be rejected. But it is the view, and as you say, it's not just the view that is relevant because it's there in the ancients. He's brought this up from the beginning. I think this from the beginning of Book One, that on this ancient view, thinking and receiving are all basically the same. It's all bodily. So I think it's all associated with that problem, with the problem that he's been previewing from the start about these antique forms of simplistic ways of thinking about cognition. So I would say it's completely true that the fact that Phantasia can be false, and the connection with these earlier views with the fact that they are embarrassed by the result that all appearances are true, is important for drawing his distinction. But again, it seems to me that he brings in Phantasia because we know it's absurd to think that it's always true. We know that it can be true or false. And we already also know that thinking can be true or false. And so accounting for falsehood in general is not a special problem as it appears here in the text. And it may be, again, that there's more going on than it looks. And that's to make that the problem, you do have to show that there's that not just the possibility of falsehood, but the project of accounting for falsehood as a problem for Aristotle. You have to do a lot of work to show that that's driving the discussion. But you're right. So that the introduction of Phantasia, you're right, is not as sudden as it looks. Assuming that he's talking about appearances there, but again, it seems to be strict in terms of the argument. It's because it does pose a genuine problem. It poses a problem because on the one hand, you have Protagoras, who apparently confuses it with perception, and so makes perception a kind of appearance. And that would be a problem because if you think of that first disjunction in Book One, that Phantasia turns out to be a kind of thinking, right, or something bodily, right, then that would be a problem, right, because it would be perception. We already know perception is bodily, but so we have to distinguish it therefore from both from perception and from thinking. And we already have, again, in Plato, the thought that opinion might be Phantasia, and so it's something that has seemed to different people at different times to be one or the other, and that is a problem because he thinks it is genuinely cognitively different from both. He wants to preserve the general truth of basic perception, that it's always right. And Phantasia can't be that way, but nor does he want to say that it's a kind of thinking in its own right. So he has to, and when he, in that section, right, when he does seem to make a point of saying it's neither the one nor the other. It's in between. It's required for judgment, and it doesn't come to be without perception. Implied, it's not the same as perception. So I think that's the main concern. But again, presuming that it's we can account for falsehood independently, I just don't see an attempt in this part of the argument to wrestle with that problem anew, or to show that Phantasia is what solves it. I think in the rest of the argument, he just presumes that it can be true or false. And then in the last part, he shows that its truth or falsity depends already on perception. So somehow or other, he thinks he's got an independent grip on falsehood.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but perhaps he knows. I mean, he says that thinking can be true or false, opinion can be true or false, and the same with respect to Phantasia. But the question is whether he is entitled to that claim, and why is he entitled to that claim? And one answer is, well, it's just what he says in this chapter, what seems to entitle him to that. Otherwise, why he would say that, especially if he, as he emphasizes at the beginning, he says that, I mean, the thinking and knowing is like sort of cognition of like by like, just as perception. So that's what creates the problem, right? That it's like by like. So, and holding that was what seemed to preclude error, in part, for the ancients. So a question would be, well, I mean, he's assuming can be true or false. Where does he show that, or where does he discuss that, or if not in this chapter? So
good. Yeah, 2 points about that. One is this reference to the like by like theory as a foil it's not it doesn't come up only here, right? When he starts to discuss perception too, he has to start with that and then show how his own view contrasts with it. So it seems to be kind of typical of his way of proceeding in the De Anima to use that as a kind of a touchstone and come back and say how his own view is different from the like by like theory. And also the question about, he just seems to assume that thinking can be true or false. I think there's really 2 questions. One is, as you say, is he entitled to it? Or does he, in fact, need to account for Phantasia, or use Phantasia to account for that falsehood in thought, even though, again, as I reconstructed, at least that's not what he does. He simply presumes that Phantasia is true or false independently of opinion, for example. And then I think there's a secondary question of if he was claimed that he was faced with that challenge, how would he independently account for saying what is not? And there, again, there's a question about psychologically how much Phantasia is required for even making true-false statements and discursive thinking in general, because he thinks it actually, at a certain point, is. But with respect to the general question about non-being, I simply don't see Phantasia itself in the way in which it's introduced here doing any special work in response to a problem that he has because of the way the problem of falsehood is, set up in Plato, for example. In just the same way that, if you think about the physics, the mistake that all these people made in thinking that there couldn't be change was that they didn't distinguish non-being full stop from not being F. And in the same way, maybe he'll say that to say what's false is not to say what is not full stop, it's to say that what is not F is F. It's borrowing Plato's answer in a way. But again, it's a question that's already been solved and arguably doesn't need Phantasia to solve it, right? So you're right, he doesn't say here, but I think nor does he say in any explicit way that Phantasia is required to account for falsehood and that I needed to do so, and that is a special problem. He just, as far as the argument goes, I think it seems to be more plausible that what he's doing is confronting obstacles to giving a separate account of thinking, including ones that he's already previewed in chapter 1, and showing how, in fact, most specifically, when you understand Phantasia or appearance correctly, the contents that are available to thought make it such that Phantasia can't be an intrinsic part of it. Because Phantasia is an activity restricted to, in fact, the aestheticon, the perceptual faculty, entirely contained within it, more sophisticated in some beings than others, but still, that's where it takes place. And so if you're asking the question about thought, and the question, do I need to include Phantasia in the conception of either the category of thinking or as an intrinsic component of any individual act of thinking, the answer seems to be no. That seems to be a concern that he has, and it seems to be a concern that he could take himself to have addressed with this argument. So I think it's, for me, much more plausible that he's assuming this question about falsehood is either resolved or he hasn't, it isn't what's occupying him here in this chapter. Even though, as you say, right, these issues and the thesis is absolutely in the background.
Thanks a lot, Nat. Ivan?
Thanks again. So it's a little bit on this, just to start on this bit that you were just talking about. So unfortunately, I tend to agree with you about the idea that he's not really addressing, his aim in this chapter is not to explain error. And he does, I think this is relevant to the question and the discussion you were just having with Edgar. He does explain error in both thought and perception at the very end of 3.6. And it's this, as you suggested, Nathaniel, it's the answer, basically Plato's answer. It has to do with predication. And he says this in other places too, in the De Interpretatione, for example. But it seems to be that it's predication that brings in both the possibility of a certain kind of truth, at least, and falsity. But I wanted to ask you something else really quickly. Do you think that, so one of the things that have really tripped people up in this chapter, I think, are his use, some of Aristotle's uses of phainasthai. Do you think that all of the uses of phainasthai in this chapter are to be associated with canonical Phantasia? So, for example, when he talks about, when he contrasts perceiving and Phantasia with the example of when he says something like, you mentioned this, but I don't think it's on your handout, when we see when we see a man but we don't perceive clearly, then we say phainasthai or something like that, phainatai. Is that an example of that in accordance with which we say that some phantasma comes to be for us? Because I think if you say yes, then you're in trouble, because now we're mixing perception and Phantasia. So I'm just I don't know, just to put my cards on the table, my inclination would be to say, well, there's a much wider range, and this is, I think, Aristotle's typical use of phainasthai, phainatai, etc., that it just means appears, something appears. That's perfectly consistent with it being a perception, what he would call a perception. And that differs from what he describes at the end of the chapter, starting at 428b10, as being a product of perception. So I think we have to be really careful in some cases, like the one I just mentioned, of attributing, every time he says phainasthai in this chapter, he's talking about canonical Phantasia.
For sure. Good. That's
what do you
really
think?
So I think there are clearly some cases where he just uses plain phainatai or phainasthai, and it does mean the target, right? When he's trying to, when he's talking about the sun example, right? He just says it's at 428b2, right? The sun appears finite for the cross. And this is supposed to be a counterexample that appeals to the nature of Phantasia as what we're talking about. So that has to be a use where here this is if something is something finitized to us, then we're experiencing that's whereby a phantasma comes to be for us. Now, a phantasma as a term, it's a curious one, and the we in that statement is not clear to me. It's strange if it's just we Greeks, because it's not a term in common use before Plato, it seems. So I would pause on that. But so the example you pointed out is also a good one, right? Of where you might be worried about it. So we say, that appears to us when we're not fully active or we're not perceiving clearly whether it's true or false. I'm sort of neutral about that one in the sense that surely if you look all throughout the corpus, absolutely, he's going to use the word the finite x in just all the ordinary ways because it's an ordinary term. But here he seems to be signaling that when we use it in a way which you would say calls attention to itself, when we are careful to use the word finite as opposed to I see a man, it's precisely because we're not sure whether it really is or isn't. And so it's the term is particularly associated in its careful use with a situation in which we take to be epistemically risky. So that's focusing in on the cognitive features of it that he thinks make it special. But you're right, I wouldn't want to make a grand claim about every use that he has there. But I think in this particular use, that's what he's trying to do with it.
Well, I think the worry or a worry. So, I mean, I think if you push that line, I mean, so you said you're neutral. Okay, fair enough. But if you push the line that in this chapter, let's just stick to this chapter. In this chapter, what he's in the example of the seeing a man not very clearly or something, we say finite. If you insist that that is a phantasma, then we have the problem that is that something that occurs as a result of a previous perception? I mean, that's what a phantasma ends up being. It ends up being, as you said, it's the product that begins with the same features as a perception. But that's not what's happening here. I mean, he's just saying that, and I think the same is true in the sun example too. He's not distinct. Here's the point, I guess. He's not in these examples carefully distinguishing phantasia from perception. He is he's saying yes, I mean, this is a point about, you can still use this to say things about phantasia, that we tend towards this language when we're in doubt. That says something about our notion of phantasia. But I think I would worry about, again, you're neutral, so this isn't you.
Well, I'm neutral about that use, but good. I mean, I think that's a good, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but
go ahead. I think I'm rambling anyway.
So I think, he doesn't just say in this passage that it's about epistemic risk, it's about specifically epistemic risk related to perception. He says whenever we're not active precisely with regard to the aisteton, the object of perception, that this seems to us to be a man, but we don't perceive clearly whether it's true or false. So he is talking about a perceptual situation there. And so where it seems to be, we're in a perceptual state, we don't know whether it's a person or a post. And that's when we highlight the unclarity of the perception by referring to it as with this verb. But here again, I think this is amassing what you might call pre-theoretical data about what it means to say that it seems to us, or maybe even seems to us perceptually in a certain sort of way. But I don't know if it is, right? Or I have a doubt. So I think that's, and again, as a way of localizing it and as distinguishing it from things that it has been mistaken for, again, as we were talking about with Edgar, has been mistaken for perception itself and for opinion, a kind of opinion itself. And cognitively, it's just not like that. It's not committed, at least necessarily, but it can be. And it's something where we would be making a mistake if we just said all, as some kinds of views end up saying that all perception is a kind of appearance, right? Because that loses the connection that he really wants to preserve between our basic capacities for perception and the basic propensities of objects to be perceptible in certain ways. But yeah, I think that's a good, this whole question about how it relates to the basic verb and this notion of a more technical use of phantasma and fantasia, which are somewhat novel, right? Is a hard series of questions. But that's why I try to divide it between a set of epistemic data and then a causal account that best explains that epistemic data.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ivan. Are there any more questions?
There seems to be one, Claudio.
Okay, Claudio, please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Nathanael, for the presentation as well. I have a small question that is also terminological, that has to do mainly with the difference in use of the terms phenomena and phantasmata. My question is basically if behind that difference in usage, you see a difference in the conceptual meaning of things. I have a slight suspicion, but I have not checked out fully all of the passages. So my question, maybe you have a better idea and can shed some light on me. Because as far as I remember, in most of cases, taking the difference in this chapter between always present and not always present, phantasmata is mostly used to talk about things when the object of perception is not present. For example, when involved in theoretical activity, or when remembering. I don't remember a time in the memoria where the word is phenomenon, for example. I think it is always phantasma. And on the other hand, most of times, but again, I haven't checked all of the passages, but most of times when the expression is phenomenon, we are talking about things present. The most typical use, I think, would be the passages where he's talking about the phenomenon agathon. Something presents itself to me as something preferable or beneficial or good. But that's mainly my question. If you would agree on the distribution of these terms, taking as criterion the being present or being absent, but if you have seen in some passages where that is clearly not the case, maybe there could be a more ambiguous passage where things are not clear, but maybe some place where the difference is clearly the contrary. But that's my question. Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Good, thank you. I mean, so I haven't studied phenomena as much, or at least as much recently, but it seems to be even wider than what you're suggesting. I mean, some uses of phenomena just refer to things that appear to be true, observational data, or even philosophical views that are commonly accepted. So I think that absolutely is a non-technical term that can do a lot of different work. including referring to things that are present to observation, for sure. Phantasmata, it seems more restricted to these kinds of uses, especially present in the Parva Naturalia, these psychological works, and seems to come to refer specifically, and these to be used here to refer to ultimately mental images or retained perceptual experience. He does say in this chapter that you can be engaged in having fantasy about something while it's present. So it isn't exclusively invoked in situations where the object isn't present. But I would say, like most uses of imagination later, it's a kind of presentation of the thing in a way that's independent of its presence or absence. Normally absent, but insensitive to whether it's present or absent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. So, Esteban?
Just a little quick question. It's kind of a follow-up from my first probably confused question. So if we can have a Phantasia about something that we are presently also observing or related to our present perception, then my question is Aristotle thinking that some cases of misperception, such as it appears to me as if there's a man there, but I'm not sure, or that maybe it's not a man, it's a tree or something, would some cases of those would be related to a Phantasia that happens to be false? And if that's the case, of course, since you already clarified to me that Aristotle has a theory of perceptual error that doesn't require the faculty of Phantasia, then I guess the question will be, how do you distinguish them? And it would have to be somewhere along the lines of which faculty is working and based on what, no? Right? I'm not sure if my question is clear.
I think I missed the first part. Is the worry about these kinds of situations where we make mistakes, but it isn't clear whether it's perceptual error or imaginative error or both?
Exactly.
Good. I think there are going to be situations in which it's not clear, and it relates to some of the issues that came up, I think, in response to your earlier question, which is that he doesn't say nearly enough about what sort of, as you would say, the kind of rich perception that we engage in ordinary life, and how much Phantasia is involved in that, either directly or indirectly. As far as this chapter goes, he seems to say that there are these three kinds of pretty robust content that perception can have, and that it can be true or false on its own. But that doesn't settle the question. And it's why some people have argued, I think persuasively in some way, that that Phantasia is required for even the psychological notion of having a holistic view of one's present situation, because at least that requires retention of a certain sort. That's not excluded by things that he says, but it's not what's asserted here. So as far as error goes here, I think, as he says, we spend a lot of time in that state, and probably the state of being mistaken, and probably there's multiple ways in which we're mistaken. But the basic sense in which Phantasia is faithful to the original perceptual experience is a key component of the idea that we can actually stop being mistaken and move on from that. I saw this question in the chat, which looks really interesting, but so about the poetics. This Phantasia problem also makes reference with enigma and metaphor, and before that, I would love to look at those chapters. I can't say that right now that I have thoughts about it. So that sounds really interesting. Is there more that you'd want to bring up right now, or should I perhaps look at this and get back to you over email or something like that. Would that make sense? Great. I'm going to try to copy that. I think it told me that I couldn't, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. I'll do that.
Okay, well,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So if there are no more questions, then I think we can then thank our speaker, Nathanael Stein, for this wonderful talk. Thanks a lot, Nathanael.
Thank you all very much for coming. These are great questions. This is the first time I've given this paper, so I was a little worried about it, but I was pleased. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. The recording of the session will be available in our YouTube channel. So just look for that. The name is CIFAR UNAM YouTube, and then you will find it. So if you want to see it again, yes, and hear it again. Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Can I make just a very small announcement? It's very local, so sorry for everyone outside the institute. It's just that on Wednesdays, this seminar works for the whole Institute of Philosophical Research. The whole community gets together, and today is the very last day when 3 of our postdoc students are part of the institute, and I just wanted to thank them publicly. They are María José Pietrini, María Clara Garavito, Laura Mojica, and Jacqueline Alcázar. I just wanted to mention them very, very quick and thank them. And sorry for the interruption. And thank you, Nathanael. It was truly a fantastic talk. I wish I could. I was more of an expert so that I could also join in the questions.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. Do you need me to stick around, or should I just? I
think we're done.
Okay.
I mean, people are already
going.
Unless I don't know if Edgar has something to tell you.
No, I think that's all. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thanks again. Nice to meet you all, and to the extent that we did. And good luck.